guys. So this is a heavy one, and I'm reacting a little bit to having reviewed a metric butt ton of information. This episode of, I guess, whatever the hell you want to call it, my live streams, I guess, is going to be talking about genocide. It's going to be talking about trauma, and it's going to be talking about the Indigenous experience with testimony from a number of different Indigenous folks that I'm going to be reading off. I'm going to be heavily referencing the This Land podcast, which has done the most extensive reporting on the particular case that we're going to be looking at. It is most likely going to be demonetized, because I'm going to be talking about Indigenous issues, and my episode that I did a while back with Suris on the horror of Indigenous boarding schools, quote unquote, did get demonetized almost immediately after the VOD went up. This one is probably going to have the same problem. I have links in the description to various Indigenous perspective sources. The This Land podcast is in there, along with the National Congress of American Indians, which is working on analyzing the recent court decision, which I'm going to go over a little bit toward the end of this stream. And the Native American Rights Fund, which talks about the law that is being challenged. So those links are all down in the description. If you guys want to check them out, please open them in another tab. But let's begin at the beginning. What are we talking about? We're talking about a legal case called Brackeen versus Holland, which has been going on effectively since 2015, 2016. It was taken to court in Fort Worth, Texas, and it concerns a white foster couple that got extraordinarily angry when the ICWA, which we'll go over what that is in a moment, prevented them from adopting a child that they had for 18 months. So what is the ICWA? What is ICWA? It is a law that is meant to protect Native American people from, for lack of a better way to put it, genocide. One of the biggest tools that has been used against the Indigenous peoples of the US, Canada, Mexico, South America has been taking children from Native American homes, whether they're stable or not by white standards, and adopting them out to white families. This is something that has been going on for generations, and it's not something that magically stopped with the passing of ICWA. But what ICWA does is it makes it so that the tribes and tribal governments, in the case of a child that has been taken away by Child Protective Services, they have the ability to potentially place that child with a tribal family or with relatives before the foster care or adoption system gets their hands on the kid. So this is really important because, as we're about to go over, frequently poverty, which runs rampant, especially on reservations, is mistaken for neglect. They will go into a house that has very little food or something like that and assume that the child is starving, even if the parents are, say, on programs or other things. Now, keep in mind that there's a massive cultural disconnect between the way that a lot of traditional, you want to use the word Western here in gigantic air quotes, families view family and the way that Native American tribes do. Now, I can't speak for every single tribe, but I know that in mine, you are not just part of your nuclear family. You are part of a number of a clan, a moiety, which is one of two very large groups that Haida people are put in. You are part of your mother's lineage and your father's house, but you are also a part of your clan and crest. And this is an extension of your family. So when I refer to, say, a friend as kin, that means that I have adopted them effectively into that wider clan. It is as close a bond as the nuclear family. A lot of white people don't understand it. There have been much more, I guess, integrated Indigenous individuals that have talked about this on YouTube. I highly recommend looking up the YouTuber Haida Life. She does a really good job. There's also Haida Language Learning, which she talks a lot about Haida culture. So a lot of other tribes have this, right? So when you take a child away from a nuclear tribal family, especially on a reservation, you are not just taking them away from the parents, you are taking them completely out of that system. So ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, was passed to stop the fact that between a quarter and a third of Native American kids were being taken away from their parents and placed with non-Native families. So that's what ICWA is. And that brings us to the case that is currently being pushed up to the Supreme Court in appeals because the Texas Supreme Court declared the entire law unconstitutional. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals federally decided that parts of it were unconstitutional, namely the preferential treatment of Native American families within the tribe, for all cases where tribes have to be notified if a child is being put up for adoption so that they can try to place it either with a family or with somebody within the tribe. So let's talk a little bit about this case, because this case is extremely complicated. And again, this is going to be a much more abridged version of the incredibly detailed reporting that has already happened from the This Land podcast, which is done by Indigenous people for Indigenous folks. I highly, highly recommend it. They also recommend a number of other Indigenous created podcasts that are well worth checking out. You can listen to it on Spotify or iTunes, a number of other places. They're not sponsoring this. I'm just a huge fan. And the level of reporting that they did, they even have links in their podcast to the actual court documents that they got with a Freedom of Information Act request. So if you want to check that stuff out yourself, you can actually read a lot of the documents that they reference in their podcast. So when I'm talking about this, I went through and I read a number of those documents, the ones that were short enough to go through. Their reporting is accurate. I highly, highly recommend their work. So let's talk a little bit about Brackeen versus Holland, because this case is all kinds of messed up. So Jennifer and Chad Brackeen decided to... They at first tried to adopt a 3-year-old Native American child. Now, this is a Christian couple, which I know that my audience is largely atheist and pagan. So when they say God told them to save a Native American child from the horrendous conditions of a reservation, let's have the collective eye roll for, like divine command theory for a second together. But they tried first with a 3-year-old, and after about 6 months, they had so much trouble with the kid's behavior that they ended up giving him back before the end of their stay and adopting, or rather fostering, a baby. And they had this baby for about a year. And here's the problem. They ended up deciding after this was a Navajo child, mind you. His name was Antonio. They ended up fostering this kid, and 2 months after the Brackeens applied to full-blown adopt Antonio, the Navajo Nation found a family that was going to adopt the baby. He had been with them for just a little over a year. She wrote a blog about it. They actually read from the blog in the podcast. The mother did, Jennifer. And they ended up fighting this decision in court. And they were They lost several court cases because of the ICWA, because there was a Navajo family that wanted to take this child in. So they reached out and they were looking for another representative of, like, a lawyer of some kind to help them out. And what they ended up finding was a law firm called Gibson Dunn. Now, the deal with Gibson Dunn is that they are largely corporate lawyers. That's what they do. They work with Shell, they work with, like, a number of huge corporations. Like, their entire thing, they've worked with Chevron, Walmart, Amazon. Basically, when their big corporate clients don't like regulations, they go after the constitutionality of government regulations. So why is it that they're now getting involved with a child welfare case? Well, the thing is, when you actually think about the ICWA and what it actually is, it is a protection for Native American autonomy. And effectively, by trying to go after that law, this gigantic law firm is potentially paving the way, especially with the incredibly conservative Supreme Court that we currently have. They are attempting to pave the way to then challenge other forms of tribal governments and autonomy, basically the whole of Native American law. But let's talk a little bit about where the bizarreness in this case happens, because they're like, let's go back to specifically Brackeen versus Holland, because keep in mind, these are not the only plaintiffs in this case, because they actually succeeded in adopting and renaming Antonio. In fact, they filed their challenge of the constitutionality of the ICWA 2 days before the foster system completed the adoption. The fact that it happened 2 days, like, before the tribe had already conceded to allow this couple to adopt this child, the other family backed down because they were scared about the litigation. The Gibson Dunn decided to file this other lawsuit. Well, you want to know what else ends up happening? Are you guys familiar with the constitutionality challenges that happened with the Affordable Care Act? And there's been a number of them for Roe v. Wade, etc. If you guys are familiar with those, you might happen to notice, if you go back through and you read a bunch of articles, that one particular Texas judge seems to always be behind them. This particular Texas judge is seemingly, allegedly, this is my opinion, it's not verified fact, but this Texas judge seems to work with conservative lawmakers to try to challenge things that conservatives don't like, and effectively legislate from the judge's seat. And this particular couple, the Brackeens, lived in his district, which is why this gigantic corporate law firm got involved with a custody case. But it gets worse from here, because they got involved with this custody case, and so did somebody else. The Texas Attorney General got involved with this custody case on the side of the plaintiffs, which is absolutely bizarre if you know anything about the way that law works. Attorneys general generally get involved in, like, high-profile crime cases that affect the state. They'll sometimes get involved, like our attorney general here in Washington challenged the mandates around keeping children in cages. They also challenged mandates around like trans bathroom legislation. They've gone after the federal government for a number of different things. So generally, like, the state attorney general will get involved in issues that concern the entire state's well-being. So the Texas Attorney General suddenly getting involved in what effectively is a settled custody case, mind you, because again, they adopted Antonio and renamed him, is extraordinarily unusual. And what they found in, like, what this land's journalists found was that they found out about this from the folks at the law firm that just so happened to take the case, because a number of folks from the from that particular law firm used to work for the Attorney General's office. It's more or less a revolving door. So why the heck did this happen? Because the Solicitor General of Texas ended up filing a motion in the custody case. So now we get to why the heck this is going on and what they needed. Because what the Texas Attorney General did, or the Solicitor General rather, did was send out a request to a bunch of other states. The document, which I'm looking right here, was forwarded to the Attorneys General of Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, Wisconsin, Wyoming, Maine, and Iowa. And all of those but 3 rejected the overture from the Texas Attorney General. Now, I'm going to read this to you guys because this was the email that was sent out, and this was actually brought out from a FOIA request in one of the 3 states that accepted. What's interesting is that what the This Land podcast journalists found was that the 3 states that accepted had the least number of ICWA cases and the least number of native tribes within their borders of all of the ones that were solicited. Now, mind you, 21 of those states rejected this proposal. They did not join them. 3 of them did. So the good news is that the majority of the states that I just listed said no. Indiana was one of the ones that said yes. Ohio said yes. And Tennessee said yes. So I'm going to read off what the Texas Senior Counsel, Attorney General, Office of Special Litigation, David J. Hacker is the person who sent it out. I'm going to read off the email. It said, today, Texas filed a new complaint against the federal government concerning the application of the ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. There's a whole bunch of nomenclature about the filing of that law, to state family law. I wanted to ask if any of you wanted to join this effort as co-plaintiffs. Here is a summary of the case. The ICWA creates a foster care and adoption preferences that require state courts to choose Indian families over non-Indian families when determining placement of an Indian child. These preferences set aside state law that would look into the best interest of the child in favor of racial discrimination that violates the 14th Amendment. In this case, a Texas family court denied Chad and Jennifer Brackeens the ability to adopt ALM, an Indian child whom the Brackeens have raised for the past 16 months simply because the Brackeens were from a different race of the child. Placing the ICWA above the child's best interest, the trial court interpreted the federal law to mean that ALM should be allowed to, or should be sent to live with an unrelated Indian family in New Mexico. Supreme Court precedent allows for the disparate treatment of Indians only when it is based on the sovereignty and self-government of the tribe, not the discriminatory treatment of individual Indians whose best interests would be served different means. Aside from the 14th Amendment concerns, the ICWA violates the 10th Amendment by commandeering state power over domestic relations, the commerce and spending clauses, and the non-delegation doctrine of Article 1. All of this is detailed in the attached draft complaint. Although we've already filed the complaint today, we can amend as of right to add co-plaintiffs within 21 days. Please let me know by November 1st whether or not you would like to join. So of all of those states that I listed, only 3 of them, Indiana, Ohio, and Tennessee, joined this FOIA request. And what is interesting and infuriating about this is what they made it about. Now, for those of you who aren't as versed in constitutional law, well, what is the 10th Amendment? The 10th Amendment is the amendment to the Constitution that effectively places, quote, all things which are not in this document as belonging to the federal government within the hands of the states. So effectively what they're arguing is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Congress do not have authoritative power federally to stop state adoption agencies and religious adoption agencies that receive state funding from placing Native American children when they are taken away by CPS with non-Native American families. Well, here's the problem with this, because this, okay, so they're calling the 14th Amendment, they're saying it's racial discrimination. You know, white people are being discriminated against based off of race, which, you know, like they don't get preferential treatment and everything else. No offense to my white viewers. If y'all are here and you're allies, I'm sorry if it hurts. Like, get upset with me if you want to. But oh boy. As I mentioned toward the beginning of this stream, one of the big problems with this is that Native American families frequently, poverty is often accused of being neglect, because Native Americans, especially those that live on reservations, tend to be some of the poorest people in the country. We just are. We were taken from lands that were very productive and put in horrible places. And so frequently, even when there isn't a problem with, say, drug abuse or alcohol abuse, which is also a major issue in reservations, poverty kind of creates those conditions. But this becomes a major problem when this sort of preferential treatment, when it's assumed that a more wealthy white family is going to provide a better home than a loving Native American family, or even members of the immediate family of the kid. And so this is where we get to, because of the fact that the Brackeens were not really aggrieved by the time this lawsuit was filed, they needed an additional plaintiff to go in. And this is where we get to the other plaintiffs in this, because we have a woman who goes by Robin. Her name is replaced for purposes of protecting her identity. And she, I guess her like first name is accurate. She's a citizen of the White Earth Nation of natives. But the child's name is replaced with Piper. So let's talk a little bit about her case. Spring of 2014, the grandmother was living with her daughter and her daughter's husband and the baby. The parents, not the grandma, not Piper, but the parents were drug addicts. And they ended up spending all of their money to the point where they couldn't make rent. They were evicted and don't believe in shelters and the like. So grandma asks to take the kid once she finds a shelter, hands her off to dad, and dad doesn't bring her back like he agreed. So August 7th, 2014, cops get a call that 2 people were spotted near an abandoned property in Minneapolis. They find 4 people with a car with drugs. It's Piper's mom and dad, their friend, and Piper. So Robin, who at this point has found shelter and wants to take the child, has a place of her own and everything, tries to go to where Piper has been taken away and talk to the foster system to get custody of her granddaughter. And this is a whole thing, because what happens to her is that the caseworker for Piper effectively tells her that because she has some minor prior convictions, very old criminal convictions, just minor things, that she is not qualified in Minnesota to even apply for a foster license toward adoption, which is not true. It just takes a few extra steps. But because she's discouraged from even applying, her, Piper's grandfather applies and is told that he doesn't know his granddaughter, who is still a baby, mind you, well enough to adopt her. And where this starts to get extraordinarily shady is that they, as per the ICWA, the foster agency sends out a notice to the tribe, to White Earth Nation, that they have a child, but they leave out Piper, or they leave out Robin, that Robin is trying to adopt Piper, that she's interested in it. They just say, "Oh, we've got this kid." They don't make any mention of that there's family members that want her. So the White Earth Nation says that they're not going to intervene because they have no idea that Robin is trying to get custody of her granddaughter. So here's where we get into where this story gets kind of scary. There is a major supply and demand issue, and I hate to refer to it this way. They talk about it in the podcast, but there's a major supply and demand issue with adoption. There are far, far, far more parents seeking adopted kids. Marrow, technically, it's not illegal. They go over that in the podcast too. Them doing the bare minimum and leaving out the grandma after they discouraged her from applying for a license. It's slimy, but it's not technically illegal. She should have still applied for a license. She didn't because she was discouraged from doing so. So they just left her out of the paperwork because there was no license or anything. There was no legal reason for them to mention her. So this is where we start talking about the Native American to white family child pipeline. Because there are a number of lawyers across a number of different states, and they highlight one in the last episode of the podcast, the one that's titled Supply and Demand, who has a much more explicit deal between Minnesota and Arizona. And they talk about another foster family and their experience trying to adopt a child. But Native American kids are prized because we are more likely to be mixed race, which means that we are more likely to be lighter complexion, which means we are more likely to look like the white families. Largely 75% of families that try to adopt are white, middle class, or upper class. So we are more likely to have a lighter complexion to thereby, quote unquote, fit in with a white family. And the majority of children that are in the foster system that are taken away from homes are people of color. Largely 35 times more likely African American and Native American kids are to be taken away from our families. I'm just going to let you guys sit with that fact for a second. The fact that POCs, specifically Native Americans and African American kids, are 35 times more likely to be taken away from our parents. A lot of this has to do with, again, poverty. But a lot of it also has to do with racism and the fact that there is this assumption that a higher class, quote unquote, white family is going to take a better care of a kid than a lower class but loving family that is even related to them or in the same tribe. So let's get into the Cliffords, because these are the two parents, Danielle and Jason Clifford, that the foster system, as soon as this kid was available, as soon as Piper was available, as soon as they kind of cleared everything with the tribe, they immediately straight went to the Cliffords, who were talking to social workers. They'd cleared all of the adoption hurdles, and they go straight to them and they go, she's been in foster care for 6 months. We need to move her to a forever home. Outright in that first meeting, are you willing to be a forever resource for this child? And they said, yes. Now, they lied to Danielle Clifford and said that there had been an extensive relative search and there was a maternal grandmother who wanted Piper, but she wasn't an option for many reasons. Many reasons here being extremely old conviction, like we're talking 20 years or more, for minor misdemeanors and such. And they just didn't even let her apply. So they end up adopting Piper, and Robin at first is allowed to visit her, but then Piper's mother gives her a card to give to Piper. And because of regulations around the way that adoption works, this was a violation of the no contact order. And so they claim that Robin has boundary issues for giving this card to Piper, and bar her and all other relatives from having any contact whatsoever with Piper. So this grandma gets completely cut off from her granddaughter after being lied to and gaslit, effectively. So when they terminate parental rights in Minnesota, this is a quote from Anita Fineday, who is being interviewed in this. In Minnesota, when they terminate parental rights, it's as if the whole biological family is deceased. They cut off visitation with aunts and uncles and grandparents. You don't even get to see your brothers and sisters anymore. But the social workers and the Cliffords didn't necessarily want Piper to have no access whatsoever to her family. So they put together like a photo book of Piper's relatives. Supposedly she could ask to see it anytime she asked. There's a recall of an incident where Piper woke up crying because she could barely remember her parents. Excuse me. I'm still getting over the lung issues, but they talked about how she'd asked to see it and how she was breaking down because she had spent most of her life with her grandmother and with her grandparents. And so she was having breakdowns and like just absolutely being awful. And Robin goes on this massive search to try to find any like lawyer that'll take her case. They won't. So then she goes to a nonprofit that serves Native families on the north side of the city she lives in. And this is called the Upper Midwest American Indian Center. And the first thing that they do is help her apply for a foster license to take this Piper back. Her convictions had already been expunged, but because of a clerical error, one of them popped up. Upper Midwest, got it taken care of, got that expunged as well. And then they contacted White Earth Nation. And White Earth Nation, upon finding out that there was a grandma who was trying to get her grandchild back, immediately filed an ICWA suit. New social workers were assigned to the case. They were trained specifically in ICWA. The county, which is Hennepin County, White Earth Nation, and the new social workers all agreed that Robin should adopt Piper. But the Cliffords disagreed. They sued Hennepin County, and Robin's adoption was put on hold during the lawsuit. The Cliffords, during this lawsuit, got dirty. They went after the fact that Robin, when she was taking care of Piper supposedly gained a bit of weight. and they tried to make Robin's arthritis an issue. She'd lived with her Piper at this point. By the time she finally got a ruling, Piper had been living with her grandmother for 4 out of 7 years. So most of her life and most of her formative years she'd spent with her grandmother. The Cliffords tried to argue that despite the fact that they'd only had her for 18 months, that they were the only stable home that Piper had ever known, implying that Robin's home was not stable and loving and safe. The family court judge disagreed. She ruled in Robin's favor, and that Piper had been traumatized by the system due to failed placement because the system had neglected to inform White Earth properly about the fact that Robin wanted to adopt Piper. So here's the problem. The Cliffords are still litigating, trying to get Piper back. The Cliffords are now co-plaintiffs on this anti-ICWA lawsuit. They are claiming, and they actually had adoption ministry, again, the same, God told us to adopt these poor Native American children because they're going to do so much better in our house than they would in a poor Native American home. They had this same idea that the original plaintiffs that we had just talked about had. That poverty is the same thing as neglect, and that there is apparently some kind of racism in allowing Native families, particularly prioritizing immediate family, to adopt Native children within their own tribe, and that there is something wrong with prioritizing that and prioritizing preservation of cultural ties. But it doesn't end here. Because the thing is, there are some other litigants involved in this. And this has to do with the supply and demand issues of the adoption agencies. There are several very, very prominent lawyers involved in this particular part of the case. The final episode of the This Land podcast, which again, I highly recommend for a much more detailed overview. And if you want to get access to the documents that I'm looking at and that I've been referring to and that they were referring to, the link is in the description to the This Land podcast, to the first episode of this particular series. It's what they've been covering for season 2. It's really messed up. They've dug deep with their FOIA requests and got their hands on a lot of things and have made that available to the public. So we can actually look at the documents that they're referencing ourselves. And the more we look into this, the more we find that, for example, this couple in Minnesota that I talked about, that they talked to, not the Cliffords, but another couple, they went to an adoption agency, they cleared everything, they got a lawyer, and they had to pay a advertising fee. And when they were asked why, there are a number of crisis pregnancy centers. Oh, you guys thought that this wasn't going to tie into the abortion ban. Oh no, we're about to talk about the abortion ban too, because these things tie together. The adoption, the crisis pregnancy center industry ties into the for-profit adoption industry, in that these lawyers and these crisis pregnancy centers put out advertisements to try to discourage potential mothers, particularly potential mothers of a lighter skin complexion, because there are, as I said, a disproportionate number of babies of color, but white families largely want to adopt white kids or lighter complexion kids that are mixed race. And so when you in this state try to adopt, there is an advertising fee that you have to pay. And this is for those ads and billboards that you see where it's like pregnant and panicking. And the crisis pregnancy centers then try to convince you to carry the baby to term and to then put it up for adoption, whatever sex the baby ends up coming out as. And this particular couple in this particular episode ends up choosing a Native American child from a Native American woman. And this woman is pushed into signing paperwork stating that she is waiving the right of the tribe. She was pushed into this by a crisis pregnancy center. That she was waiving the right of the tribe to interfere in the adoption of this child. And the adoptive couple are pressured by this lawyer into signing paperwork saying that they won't talk about the adoption particularly publicly for 7 years. And when they ask their lawyer why, they end up getting the reply that that's the statute of limitations for the ICWA, which they go into researching and they find out about the ICWA, and it ends up feeling scummy to them. So they ended up more or less backing out of trying to adopt this child. Because of the fact that there is effectively an adoption pipeline for especially mixed race Native American children that are extraordinarily profitable. Now, keep in mind, when you try to adopt, we've looked into this because my family, as I've talked about, I can't have kids. I have polycystic ovarian syndrome. I am effectively sterile. I have to take birth control just to not bleed out because my cycles are messy and long and random because my hormones are out of whack. And so we, as a poly relationship, have talked a few times about adoption. And when we started to look into the process, even in my state, which, the adoption and foster care system here is messed up, don't get me wrong, but it is less messed up than a lot of places. The process often deals with religious institutions, for one thing, but for another, there's an entire process you have to go through. And most folks don't realize this when they want to look into adopting children. So one of them is that they have to go through a home review, which means that somebody gets to walk through your house. They do extensive background checks to make sure that there's no even calls to the house. Like, you don't even have to have a conviction. It's like within the past 2 years, I think, there can't even have been police calls to the house that have anything to do with people in the house. They do reviews of your income. They do reviews of the neighborhood that you live in. It takes months and months, and you have to pay thousands upon thousands of dollars to go through all of the applications, to get all the paperwork. And once you get approved from there, you have to keep a lawyer on retainer. And at that point, you start getting emails with prospective children. Quite often, these are emails with images of the parents because, like I said, a lot of these children come from crisis pregnancy centers. So if you're looking to adopt as opposed to foster, which fostering is temporary, adoption is permanent. That's the difference between the two. Sometimes fostered children get adopted. More often than not, foster care is a temporary placement while the parents that the child got taken away from work on their case. So more often than not, foster children go back to their original families. But as I mentioned in the case of Piper, she didn't. But when you're talking about the adoption process, you start getting sort of advertisements yourself, and you have to pick a kid that you're interested in potentially and make arrangements with the parent to get everything all set up. So as Astrid just mentioned, they will send out private investigators to bother your neighbors, your friends, your associates, your employer. It's pretty extensive. It's massive, which all of that is said to be in service of the child, but it also often serves to exclude pagan parents, parents of color, folks that are not upper middle class, folks who have even, had a call for like an argument or something like that. Like, it can exclude otherwise very good families, and yet somehow manages to miss a lot of extremely abusive families. In fact, before the ICWA was passed, here's a fun fact. There were farming families that would mass adopt children and then use them as farm labor. And this was part of the reason why the ICWA was passed by Congress under Jimmy Carter, because of the fact that there was such rampant abuse that was uncovered. Again, remember, between 25 and 30% of Native American children were taken out of their families and then adopted out to non-Native families. So effectively, this has become a sort of, or it had become a sort of pseudo, as Astor just said, slave trade. So when you're talking about the ICWA and you're talking about whether or not it still applies, consider the fact that still to this day, as I repeated at the beginning, you are 35 times more likely to be taken away from your family if you are Native American or African American. And keep in mind also, because of the massive child abuse that has happened with the foster system, a lot of other countries, which is where a lot of the supply and demand problem was being taken care of from, Ethiopia, significantly less so China. You can still go to China if you have enough money and adopt a child from one of their adoption agencies, though they've also been changing their one-child policy as of late. They just moved it up to 3 children. So there's going to be less Chinese children up for adoption, especially Chinese girls or kids with disabilities, because that was where a lot of children in China especially were coming from. Because of the one-child policy, children with disabilities would just be dumped. And if they were lucky, they'd be found by an adoption agency. If they weren't, there are mass graves. But Ethiopia stopped sending children to America because of high-profile murder and abuse cases from foster and adoptive families. Very similar with other African nations. Brazil did the same thing. So a lot of the developing world, where a lot of extra children that were, unwanted, were coming from to sort of fill this gap, which according to the podcast was 100 to 1, 100 families to 1 baby. Because keep in mind, most people don't want to adopt kids. They want to adopt babies. They want to be able to imprint on that child and have them be the only family that they can remember, to not have the sort of split in consciousness that can happen with adopted kids when they still remember their families and they still remember their parents and they don't feel like their adopted family is their family. So with this sort of gap in the market that has now been created, and again, it is a market. It is extraordinarily profitable for these lawyers, for adoption lawyers, especially for these adoption agencies. With this gap in the market, they now turn back to Native Americans, African Americans, and other racial minorities. So when we're looking at the ICWA, when you consider the fact that, at some point there were drills at one point, like 30 years ago, that Native American kids would have, where if somebody pulls up to the drive, you run and you hide, because the social workers will just take kids. And social workers will be assigned to families for the most trivial of reasons, to take children. When you remember the fact that boarding schools, the last one in America, supposedly closed its doors in 2009, the year I graduated, 2009. We haven't even made it 20 years since the last of those closed. They had their heyday in the 1980s, 10 years before I was born. I'm going to stress that. If you haven't seen my stream on boarding schools and on the bodies that they've been finding in boarding schools, yes, bodies, murdered children, kids that were beaten to death, kids that were starved, kids that were highly abused. Now, I gave a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode, so again, I'm sorry. This is stuff I have to talk about in order to talk about this topic. But when you are talking about the ICWA and whether or not it is antiquated, as is being argued in this court case, you have to consider the statistics that I just cited. You have to consider what happened with the boarding schools. And you have to consider the problem of the white savior complex, because of the constant constant assumption that upper class white people are going to have a better home, a better environment than the direct families and tribes of these children. It is not racism for cultural conventions to be respected just because a white parent does not understand clan ties, does not understand moiety ties. Just because they don't understand that does not make it racism to prioritize those cultures and the autonomy of tribal governments, which are supposed to be sub-nations in and of themselves. Not that they actually are, but and we'll get to that. They're legally designated as such, but we've talked about police and target practice. We've talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have talked about so many ways in which the federal government makes it pretty freaking clear that we are not actually our own sovereign nations. We're just that on paper only, so that, you know, folks that are descendants of colonizers can feel better. And keep in mind, I'm not trying to say that every white person on the planet is automatically a colonizer. I'm not saying that. Descended from, yes. Inheriting a great deal of benefit from, yes. Still benefiting systemically, yes. If you want to adopt a kid and I want to adopt a kid, you are far more likely to be able to do it than I am just by the color of your skin. And that's just the way it is. But when you're talking about the ICWA and whether or not it is antiquated, you need to consider how many children are taken away just due to poverty. And you need to consider the tribal ties. And you need to consider this pipeline of for-profit adoption that has been created to get around the law as it exists. Now, let me ask you, given everything that we have now talked about throughout the course of this particular live stream, what makes you think that it could possibly be any different? Like, what makes you think that Native American families are going to have any shot whatsoever, given especially Piper's experience and Robin's experience? What makes you think that Indigenous families, if this law is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, if there isn't some sort of public outcry? Because remember, abortion rights are intimately tied to this. There is a pipeline of adoption that has been created because a lot of us are mixed race and we're lighter skinned. Like, we just are, especially if you're from a northern tribe. We are northern tribes. We don't look like Navajo and Cherokee folks do. We look different. We look more like white people, which makes us high demand for these adoption schemes because white parents often want kids that look like them. So, by the way, I see what you're saying, Scattershot and Tuka. The problem is that the U.S. is such a large percentage of the UN's military force that there's very little chance that any international authority is actually going to do anything whatsoever about anything the U.S. does. We violate international law by using tear gas on our own people frequently, and we've never been branded terrorist internationally officially because our military blows the hell out of just about anybody other than maybe China. Unfortunately, might makes right internationally, and as much as the U.S. likes to puff up its chest about itself and freedom and how much better it supposedly is than the entire rest of the world, we don't get held to account for the vast majority of shitty things we do here in America. So when you come back to the ICWA and this case and why it's so freaking important and why I wanted to talk about it and get the word out there, which please, when this broadcast is over, I tried to make it as concise as I possibly could. Unlike my last one where I sort of rambled a little bit, this one I tried to make as concise as I could. I've linked in the description. The one of those links, the Native Americans Rights Fund, is actually a charity. I highly recommend donating to that charity if you have a little bit of spare money. They are currently trying to work to fight against this law. And they are trying to spread awareness of this that is going on, because here's the issue. Not only is the ICWA more relevant than it's ever been, because we are talking a tool of genocide when we're talking about tribes like mine, where there are less than 10 people left that natively speak our languages, that have to create immersion programs and movies and other things just to keep our cultures still alive, where languages are rarely spoken off of tribal grounds because of the fact that there's just no use for that language. Like, English has taken over everything. Not only that, but if the ICWA goes down, if it is actually struck down as unconstitutional, what that does is that sets a precedent to break down all other laws that help protect Native American tribal sovereignty. Indigenous sovereignty is at risk. And this is at a time where fracking is at an all-time high, where the Biden administration, for all of their hooing and hemming and hawing about the environment, have issued more fracking licenses than any administration prior. This is where these greedy corporations, remember who I said the particular prosecuting law firm was, who they work for? Shell, Conoco, Amazon. These companies have been trying to get at tribal land. Remember the Dakota Access Pipeline. They've been trying to get at tribal land for fracking and resource extraction purposes for decades. For decades. And because of tribal sovereignty, because of treaties between the U.S. government and these tribes, they can't most of the time. The U.S. Department of Environmental Resources tends to default to the Bureau of Indian Affairs more often than not. Here's the issue, though. If this is struck down, then that gives states a fuck of a lot more power when it comes to these sorts of federal congressional treaties and regulations. That is effectively ruling that these micronations with treaties with the federal government no longer have that kind of sovereignty, which gives the states potentially power to override those congressional treaties, which gives the states the potential power to start doling out tribal lands and resources, including children, which are considered human resources by the government under this ruling. It opens up the possibility and precedent for litigation to potentially destroy tribal sovereignty as we know it. And Indigenous resistance, as if you follow me on Twitter, links in the description below to my Twitter. If you don't, if you follow me on Twitter, I actually linked to a thread talking about a report that came out recently that shows that Indigenous resistance across the world accounts for a 25 to 30% reduction in emissions each year. Indigenous peoples fight our ass off to preserve our lands because we are intimately tied to our lands. We are. This place that I stand on, the bones of my ancestors are buried beneath my feet. Names of relatives of mine are on the incorporation documents for several cities in my state. There was, in the podcast, there was an interviewee who talked about umbilical cords being tied to the mountains. The fact that Rainier overlooks me at all times. I've lived in other places and had to come back to Washington because this is where my heart beats. And I don't know how to describe that in any other way that will make sense apart from the fact that there is a piece of my soul in this place. And that's not to say that other people can't live in those places. That's not to say that, you, if you happen to be white, are somehow responsible for what your ancestors did. But if you care about us, please care about this. Please share this video, share the podcast if you can find it with anybody you think might be interested in it. Share this around, spread the word, donate some to these charities that are attempting to fight this. Talk about it with people that you know who might be receptive to hearing about it. Make a big stink. Write to Congress about this. Especially if you live in one of the states that rejected, or especially actually if you live in one of the states that is currently, like, a lot of places elect their attorneys general. Pay attention to your ballot if you live in Ohio, Indiana, Texas, or Tennessee. I think it's Tennessee is the other one. Write to your state Congress about this. Write to your attorney general and let them know that they're not getting your vote if you're from one of those states. If you're from one of the 20 states that rejected it, write to Congress. Tell them that you are unhappy with this. Fight for this. Fight for us. If you are an ally, fight for us. Because what's happening right now is that corporate interests are trying to strip us of our rights quietly because nobody remembers that we exist, because people think genocide is a thing of the past. But right now, they are trying to strip tribal rights to our children, to our families, to our own identities. Because remember, when you adopt out a kid to a white family, that is a loss of the right of the family from which that child was taken to see them anymore, more often than not. That is a loss of your heritage. That is a loss of a sense of part of who you are. Our cultures still live and breathe because we fight. But we are so seldom heard because we are sequestered off into very desolate, very poor areas where places like, I believe it was North Carolina, steal our right to even vote by taking away voting rights for anybody who has less than a P.O. box, even though there are no residential addresses on tribal land because it is a sovereign nation. They are trying to take away our future. Without children, there is no culture, there is no future. If you are an ally, please spread this video around in any group that you hang out with. Spread the podcast, spread the links to the charities that I linked to the American Indian Congress, which is working on the Congress of American Indians, which is working on their response to the recent ruling. Because the recent ruling, as I said, struck down portions of it specifically relating to the tribe's right to intervene and move things into tribal courts. Please, if you care about us as allies, take steps to fight with us. Contact your local tribal leaders if you have any sort of relationship with them, and see if there's anything that you can do on a state level to help fight for this. Contact your state Congress and try to see if they can pass provisions just in case that honor this original legislation within their states. If they're going to fight for states' rights, fight for your state to preserve our rights. Please fight with us. This video is most likely going to be demonetized as soon as I end the broadcast. The last one was, I used several trigger words that the algorithm does not like. Most Native American content ends up with that as the case. But as an Indigenous person who lost a portion of my culture because my mother tried so hard to fit in with the expectations of her white husband, who was not my father, I am deeply affected by this as a biracial person who has been invalidated my entire life. I can't imagine if I would have been taken away, maybe I would have had a better life, but I might not ever have known who I was. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. The video might be a little bit late this week, or it might not happen until next week because I was supposed to record and edit, but the more I learned about this, the more I read about it, the more emotional I got, and the more I felt the need to do something with my tiny platform to spread the word about it, to get it into the algorithm, to get people talking about it. If you see Indigenous voices talking about this in other places than just the ones I linked, spread the word. Let me know in the comments with links. It'll get automatically blocked by YouTube because I get a lot of spam, but I am going to be checking the held comments over the next few days. So if you see other Indigenous creators talking about that, link to it in the comments so that I can get that into the description as well. If you're watching this on the playback, or even now when I end the broadcast, please drop down into the comments and leave one so that we can help fight the fact that the algorithm's likely going to suppress this video. Please hit the like button if you haven't. Share this around. Do everything that you possibly can to get this knowledge out there, because these things happen in silence, and that's how our rights get stripped. So I'm asking you, my very small but very dedicated audience, please fight with us. right? As I've said 1,000 times, we're stronger together. Have a good night,